Hello, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Happy Friday morning. My name is Andrea Awacode. I am the Diversity and Special Projects Manager at the City of Mesa in Arizona, and I am so happy to be here with you this morning for this session, Equitably Shaping Our Future Through Environmental and Sustainability. So we know this is a huge topic many of our cities are facing, and it's a global issue and certainly something that we're addressing here in our country on how we can address equity within our climate impact and protecting our environment. So today we have a great panel for you this morning. Here on stage with me is Andrea Odegaard-Begay. She is the Senior Associate at the Hazen and Sawyer and City of Phoenix Environmental Quality and Sustainability Commission member. And then virtually with us, we also have the honor of having Nancy Allen with us. She is the Environmental Programs Manager with the City of Phoenix. And Dr. Ninia Campbell, Research Associate at the National Hazard Center with the University of Colorado here in Boulder. So thank you so much, ladies, for taking part of this very important conversation. We are going to start it with a few intro slides so these ladies can tell you a lot more about their specific work. And what we tried to shape this panel today for you is to give you different perspectives on the different partners that have to come together to help make an impact in this work. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Nancy to give us an introduction on the work that she does in the City of Phoenix. And then we will do a roundtable after all of the ladies have given their introduction. We'll do a roundtable of panel questions and really get into the topic. So Nancy, I'll go ahead and turn it over into you.
Thank you. So I'm Nancy Allen. I'm the Environmental Programs Administrator for the City of Phoenix. And my group is a function that works out of the City Manager's office. And that is significant in that we are citywide and not attached to any one department. And I've started with a slide on climate action. So right now, the City of Phoenix is diligently working on getting our climate action plan prepared and ready to go before our City Council next month for approval. We have been working on this for a little while now. We did a two-prong engagement. Last year, we had a climate action framework where we did quite a bit of interaction with the community to get feedback on that. And one of the major themes that kept occurring was environmental justice and equity. And you will hear that quite often, that you cannot do climate action planning, you cannot do mitigation unless you include equity and environmental justice in that as well. And so we have definitely learned that. So next slide, please. A lot of our primary feedback through the framework and through the feedback that came with the climate action plan this summer, had to do with our air quality in Phoenix. Heat, vulnerable populations having access to shade and cool places, having access to clean water, and being able to find healthy food. Phoenix has quite a few food deserts. We are the 5th largest city in the US, and we have more food deserts than we should. And all of these things really came out during our community outreach process for our climate action plan. So next slide. So because we did do this two-prong approach where we started with the framework last year and then went to the climate action plan this year, we were able to see where a lot of need was. And so because of that, we were able to get two things into our new budget for this year. And those are the Office of Heat Response and Mitigation and an Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Both of those offices will be situated in the City Manager's office, like mine, and the head of those offices will be my direct peer. And that will be a great asset to us as we continue our planning, because as everyone knows, within a huge municipality, especially one the size of Phoenix, silos tend to build up. And when that happens, we don't get a whole picture of what's going on. We can't assess the need or where it's at. Having these two offices especially the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. The City of Phoenix has never approached anything like this before. This is a first, and we are excited that we're going to be able to get this built into every aspect of city services that we do. Part of that, and you heard this in the introduction, is Andrea, who is a member of our Environmental Quality and Sustainability Commission. That commission provides recommendations and policy actions to our city manager and city council. And this has been a big topic for them recently. And we do expect them to be working on recommendations as far as where the need is greatest and policy recommendations for these two new offices in the near future. So with that, I'll turn it over to Andrea because she's going to be involved in that work coming up very soon.
Thank you, Nancy. So I primarily work in the private sector. My background is in water and wastewater engineering, and we work closely with municipalities in developing and maintaining sustainable infrastructure related to water. But I personally live in the city of Phoenix and wanted to get more engaged in my community and leverage that experience and expertise that I have, and notice that they have this commission on environmental quality and sustainability, which, as Nancy mentioned, is focused on advising and providing support to city management related to their environmental policies. And that includes water in a very arid environment. How are we providing resiliency and sustainable water supplies, and making sure that there is equitable access to not just running water, but safe, good, clean water across our communities? How are we addressing heat impacts with climate change? And how is this disparately affecting our communities? How are we handling waste management, transportation issues that vary across our communities based on vulnerabilities such as race, income, etc. If you can put the slides back on the screen and go to the next slide. So part of that, a key focus is that environmental justice equity portion. And these values were amended and borrowed in large part from a study that was done in the state of Colorado, but making sure that there is equitable representation when we develop these policies. Easily accessible opportunities for any interested persons. Are we going into each of our communities and making sure that everyone has a voice and is able to provide input in what their needs are and how we can best address those from their perspective? Are we prioritizing benefits? Are we strategizing benefits for overburdened communities that in many cases may have fewer financial resources or abilities to implement things without some additional support? Are we making sure that there is an equitable distribution of improvements that we're recommending that reaches really everyone in the communities that we serve? And then economic impacts. Are we decreasing costs for these communities while increasing economic opportunities? And that's really going to go hand in hand with what you see on the screen as value 5, as access to solutions. We want to promote clean, equitable technologies. And when we're talking about that, a lot of times those with fewer financial resources don't have access to those cleaner technologies. And so there's an additional barrier there. Are we taking into account economic impacts? Do we have funding sources, grant programs, other means of eliminating some of those barriers so that they are mitigated and everyone has equitable access to these solutions? Are we minimizing health impacts, and are we building resilience? Are the policies that we're putting in place improving the quality of life, and are they doing so on a long-term basis that can be easily maintained? And then if you go to the next slide, I just want to touch briefly on EPA EJ screen, which demonstrates, this is generally the Phoenix Metro, takes into account the demographics and environmental indicators of your region, and is a way that we can visually see the disparate impacts of certain environmental indicators and climate change in our communities, in a way that we can track and those impacts and see if our efforts are truly making a difference, or what more can we be doing, and where can we be doing that.
Thank you, Andrea and Nancy. I think that gives a great insight into the work within local government. And next, we are going to hear from Dr. Ninia Campbell, who is bringing then the lens and a good partnership to local government. And that's the work of research and the universities and how we can look to them to support. So Dr. Campbell.
Thanks so much. So yes, I'm bringing a little bit of a different lens. Again, I'm a research associate at the Natural Hazards Center. And the Hazard Center was really established to facilitate these kinds of connections between research and practice, developing that evidence base. So it was founded in 1976 at the University of Colorado Boulder by Dr. Gilbert White, who is an esteemed geographer, along with his wife and a small group of committed staff and students. And this was at a pivotal time following the landmark first assessment of natural hazards research in the United States. And one of the key recommendations from that assessment was that the nation needed some kind of clearinghouse to compile, translate, and share information, as well as to connect academic hazards research, disaster management, and policy communities. So today, the Natural Hazards Center kind of remains true to that core mission of the center. So we have this vision of envisioning a just and equitable world where knowledge is applied to ensure that humans live in harmony with nature. And so really applying that to the world of hazards and disasters, keeping that at the forefront. We do that through four main mission areas. The first is we're committed to translating and sharing information to other researchers, to practitioners, policymakers, journalists, people who need to have the research that's being produced and need to know about the policies and practices, what's effective, what's not. We also build connections across diverse communities to ensure that the work is, that rigorous work and practice can occur. And so building those connections so that there's also cross-fertilization across different areas that can be siloed. We advance new knowledge in the social sciences and in interdisciplinary spaces through our research, through supporting research of other collaborations. And we also educate and mentor the diverse next generation of hazards and disaster researchers and mitigation practitioners who work to reduce risk and expand our knowledge about how we can bring those more equitable approaches. Next slide, please. And so the next question then is, how do we do all of this? And there's always a flurry of activity at the Natural Hazards Center around a diverse array of initiatives. So consistent with our pillar of advancing knowledge, we engage in basic research or applied research to, the basic research is advancing our understanding of the social world, answering some of those tough questions that we don't know, areas we don't know about. Applied research is really more focused, targeting explicitly the needs of a particular organization or program. But overall, with our research focus, we strive to apply what we know, dig deeper into issues where we need more information, and develop the evidence for best practices. How do we support communities? How do we address disparities in communities, as we know that there are inequitable outcomes when we're looking at disaster impacts? We also bring people together through our annual Natural Hazards Research and Application Workshop that brings together researchers, students, practitioners, policymakers, again, bridging those silos and encouraging that discourse among groups that don't often have opportunities to engage with each other. And additionally, we back to this mission area of translating knowledge, we provide training and resources to researchers and practitioners. So for example, our Making Mitigation Work webinar series offers, which we offer in partnership with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, features speakers and on new kinds of research that are coming out. It highlights processes and mitigation, policy and practice. So really it creates that knowledge sharing mechanism. And additionally, with each 1 hour, one contact hour of these webinars for emergency management, they're able to get, emergency managers are able to get certificates for that through the International Association of Emergency Managers through their certification program. And then finally, we offer a variety of information products to inform decision making. So our Research Counts series, for example, is a series of briefs on research-related products, research-related information, where people can raise new questions, where they can explore findings and enduring lessons about disasters. And other products that we develop in-house, we do things like risk communication, which is a project that I've been involved in that develops guidance for practitioners within the Army Corps of Engineers and other people working in water resources management on how to communicate with socially vulnerable communities. Also, the Sean series, which is a Societal Experts Action Network, is something that I'm working on in collaboration with the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine to develop what we call rapid expert consultation reports. And these answer pressing policy questions that the research timeline is often too long to be useful for by scouring what we know already about a particular topic in the area of in the era of COVID-19 to develop guidance to inform decision making. And finally, the next slide. We focus on equity and environmental impacts broadly by trying to help people understand the social roots of risk, really zeroing in on that mandate we have to illustrate how the historical, political, economic, and social context shape disaster outcomes across the disaster management life cycle, whether it's in preparedness, response, recovery, or hazard mitigation. We develop partnerships to help create that evidence base and also diversify the next generation of practitioners and scholars. And that's something I'd be happy to talk more about as we get into the conversation. But finally, one of the primary partnerships and one that I'm most involved with is with William Averitt Anderson Fund, or the Bill Anderson Fund. And that's where we work with PhD students in hazard-related fields to bring those important perspectives that are often missing from conversations about environmental justice, about how we prepare our communities equitably to be more prepared for disasters. And I'd be happy to talk more about that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. So as you can see, we have three wonderful ladies here with just a wealth of knowledge. So we're going to jump into a conversation just so we can pull from their different lenses. I know in the city of Mesa, we recently had passed our climate action plan in June this summer. And so it was looking up to cities like the city of Phoenix and certainly here in Denver and bringing in the research that we have from our different university partners like this to be able to really comprehensively look at the angle of equity and making sure that we are going to be reaching our community as we create some of these big aspirational goals, carbon neutrality by 2050, and some of these really big reaching goals have to take the lens of how it's impacting our community members. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and jump off into some questions. The first one will be for you, Nancy. What role does local government play in helping to build equity within the work of environmental and sustainability? And essentially, what would that ideal collaboration look like?
So with a city or municipal government, we are a service-based group. And that's why we're there. We're there to serve our residents. And so we need to be able to know what those needs are, when that need happens, how to respond to that need. And especially when you're as big as Phoenix, that can sometimes be difficult. I'll give you an example that we learned a hard lesson with our climate action plan in just a few months ago. Within the city of Phoenix, it is not usual. We just do not translate everything we do into Spanish. And quite a few of our residents are primarily Spanish speakers. And so we knew that was going to be an issue. My department is very small. We do not have funding to do that. So I had to choose whether or not we were going to translate the climate action plan or the framework into Spanish. I couldn't do both. So we chose the climate action plan. And then when we had departments coming back to us with new updated information toward the end, we couldn't get that information to our graphic designer, get that embedded in the climate action plan, and then to the Spanish translator in a timely manner to get that out on the street at the same time as our English version. And we had another thing as well. Our climate lead is bilingual, and we insist that he read everything that we get translated so it doesn't lose context, that the technical information in there is translated appropriately. And so because of that, we were about a month late getting our Spanish version of the climate action plan out. And we got a lot of grief for that. And that has, I think it's going to be a good thing because it's something my department has fought for, is that it's just by default that we do everything in English and Spanish. It's not an afterthought. And with the climate action plan, it was not an afterthought. We just didn't have the funds to do both documents. That's just what it comes down to. And so that is a need. And I am really hoping this is one of the first things that our new Office of Equity and Inclusion and Diversity tackles when they get there, is a way that as the city of Phoenix, its default is that everything we do is in Spanish and English, that every webinar we have, that every streaming event we have does offer real-time Spanish translation. Right now, for our council meetings and things of that nature, it's consecutive, which can be time-consuming and disruptive at times. We really need to have this integrated into our day-to-day as we do business. It's not even a thought, we just do it. And that's just one example. But as a city employee, I'm there to serve the city of Phoenix residents. And that's what we all do. And we can't do that if we stay in our silos, if we don't listen to our colleagues, if we don't get out and see things, and if we don't respond to a need, like linguistically isolated communities that do need to have information brought to them in their native language.
Thank you, Nancy. That is such an important topic. I think many of us can definitely look at within our own organization. In the Phoenix Mesa area, we have an upwards of 30–40% of our populations are Spanish speaking. And so Nancy hit it on the head in terms of this should not be something that departments and organizations are looking at as a choice, having to decide, is one project more important than the other? A big part of the equity framework is then making sure that that information is going to our residents as they should need it. And that can be in multi-languages, that could be in easy English formats, different accessibility of information. So that's definitely a much needed area of further discussion with, I think, in many of our cities, whether it's Spanish or other languages that are your primary, secondary languages in your cities. So thank you, Nancy. That was a very good point to kick off this conversation with. So next, I'm going to turn it over to Andrea. Who are some of the different stakeholders in the process, and how can they support municipal efforts?
So our stakeholders are largely our community members and those that serve our various communities, grassroots organizations, community advocacy groups. So we need to make sure that we are fully engaging them in every way possible. As was mentioned just now, translations into the languages spoken in these communities are going to be critical, but it's also going to be critical to go to them and have various offerings for them to provide feedback, to have listening sessions in these communities at familiar places, whether it be a rec center, a community center, a school, and leverage that to make our community partners true partners and collaborative in development of our policy. Listen to what their needs are and use that to inform policies and ensure that equity across our various communities. Make sure that these meetings are held at lunch, in the evening, provide multiple opportunities for feedback and engagement. And then, even as Senator Moreno mentioned this morning during the keynote, engaging our youth. I mean, they are the future, they're the next generation. They're going to inherit what we're leaving behind and what we're establishing right now, and taking that forward into the future. Our students, high school level, college level, are thinking outside the box. They don't have those already entrenched ideas, and can provide some valuable input. And even at the elementary school level, providing information, just making them aware of their environment and what the issues are in their community to help develop them as future leaders. So in short, I went off tangent here a little bit, but our community members are our stakeholders and those that serve them. And we need to make sure that we are fully engaging them and not just providing information, but including them in the process as we develop our policy.
Thank you, Andrea. And I think we heard some of that yesterday as well during our lunchtime keynote with the Rocky Mountain Partnership, hearing the great youth committee member that's able to go out there and really meet the community where they're at. There were some valuable tips that we could have learned from that young lady yesterday. So shifting the conversation just a little bit then, Dr. Campbell, how can we work to make emergency response more equitable? I know something that we're not used to in the Phoenix area, the snow that you face here in Denver area. And then of course for us with heat, all of these different severe weather elements that we're seeing across the news on a daily basis. How can we prepare across all boundaries in regards to making emergency response more equitable?
Well, I actually think that we just landed on a great point of departure for this question, which is engaging stakeholders and investing in the next generation. Certainly, that's something that we do a lot at the Natural Hazard Center, the both of those things, but particularly with the investment in youth, investment in the next generation. That's something I do a lot in my work and really value, both in my hat with the Natural Hazard Center and also as a deputy director of the William Avert Anderson Foundation Fund, to work with communities, diverse communities, to bring them into these spaces so that they're also bringing those perspectives into emergency management, into disaster science. I think it's really important to recognize that we have to have our communities of research and practice be reflective of the communities that those professional fields are serving. So that's a really important part of this, bringing those diverse perspectives in and understanding of the challenges and needs and capacities of different communities. Also working with stakeholders, though, engaging stakeholders is a really important component of this, not just pushing information out to people, but really asking what their needs are, not predefining assumptions and using top-down approaches are also really important things. We know a lot about which communities are vulnerable in disasters, but the ways that those kinds of vulnerabilities play out differ. And so it's really important to not make decisions for people, but to really involve them in disaster planning so that we can best serve the communities that are most at risk and most at need. And then also investing in those communities. It's easy, I think, especially for government decision makers to direct resources, direct attention to the communities that are the loudest, that have the most resources, that are most effective often in reaching out. But that really leaves marginalized communities out of the picture and kind of reinforces a lot of the issues that they experience that place them in greater risk at disasters, that account for their greater disaster losses. And so also seeking out, actively trying to engage people, meet them where they are, and not just listening to the folks who come to you, recognizing that it's a privilege to be able to advance your cause with the people in the seat of power, right? And so making sure that there is space for all voices to be heard is also important. And so I want to just acknowledge that's all of these things that we're talking about, all of the themes that are emerging also apply in the disaster field, especially in practice, but also in research. I think it's important for us to be listening to communities and collaborating with communities rather than taking this extractive model where we go and parade into a place, tell them we're experts, and tell them to tell us what they know so that we can go and then publish off of it and not share that information with them. That's something that's a problem in the research realm as well. And so another piece of this is that those of us who are producing information that we're hoping will translate into practice need to be working with communities and collaborating with them in the research process so that we're understanding the context in which we're operating.
Thank you. So I think a big part of what we're hearing from all three of these different ladies with all of their different perspectives is how much community engagement is one of the essential pieces in helping to build equity within this line of work. So with that, Nancy, can you please tell us what are some of the strategies then that Phoenix has done well when you were going out with your climate action planning and being able to elaborate on some of those engagement strategies you have personally used?
So not just with climate action planning, but in my department, we also have food systems that is within my group. And I'm lucky enough to have Roseanne Albright is the lead for that. And she's done a phenomenal job with our food systems here in Phoenix. And one of the things Dr. Campbell was talking about is listening to those communities. So those communities don't just have one voice. There are multiple folks in those communities. They come from different backgrounds. They have different needs. And one of the things that we found, and this was primarily through some of the food work first before the climate work, is that there is a disconnect on how to talk to the city or the government. And so we did provide some assistance on getting community members to their council districts. Because if they get to those folks, they can talk to the council districts. That's when my office gets support to get something done that we need to get done. I can talk about something till I'm blue in the face, but it doesn't mean anything if our council folks don't hear from the community about it. So providing that information on how to communicate is a big deal, is providing those channels. You can't just assume that folks know how to do that. And that has really been a challenge in the days of COVID, especially at the beginning, when folks don't necessarily all have access to virtual equipment to attend a public meeting. They may not have access to that. They may not have internet, and access to broadband is an equity issue, because if you don't have that, how can you participate in a community meeting where there's no in-person meeting? So, you know, it was really good when we got our libraries back open, so folks could use the broadband there. The city of Phoenix has done some hotspots around the city, especially for kids, where there were a lot of kids or seniors, so they could participate in things and programs that they had because everyone was stuck inside. So that's an issue. We did do that well with food, helping folks get connected. We are in the process of doing that with climate. And I'll say in progress, and it's always going to be in progress, because there are so many folks out there that it takes all of us listening and actually going out and talking to people to get as many engaged as we can, because there's not just one community group in a community. There's not just two. There are all sorts of needs out there. And we can't just sit around and silo ourselves and think that we've heard everything about this from this community, because you haven't. There's always somebody else that you need to outreach to and you need to listen to. But providing that assistance on how to get in contact with the decision makers, how to do something with the city or the government, or how to access food at a food bank, or how to advocate to get this new grocery store or farmer's market in your community. Those things are important, not just talking to people and talking at them.
Thank you. And I think that's another really key takeaway when we're looking at any work under the umbrella of diversity, equity, and inclusion, is that the engagement should never stop. You should always be continually looking at different groups, trying to look at where those voices are that have missed. And then throughout the length of the project, or throughout the length of the efforts that you're doing, continually making sure that you are looking at it with different lenses of those community voices. So switching again the topic just a little bit now, Andrea, how do you know if you're making an impact? How can we see when we have these big lofty goals that are 20, 30, 40 years out? How are we knowing that we are moving the needle?
Well, certainly when we're establishing policy goals, we want to also establish metrics that apply to them so we determine whether we are making an impact. And largely those metrics should be quantifiable, right? And that's easier to do when we're talking about environmental quality. Our ozone levels decrease, our particulate matter levels decrease. We can look at distributive justice. Does everyone in all communities have equal, like, vertical access or horizontal access to a bus stop or public transportation? Is there the same amount of tree coverage in one area versus another? This is one area where the EJ screen, the EPA tool, comes in handy, where you can look at those really quantifiable metrics in relationship to demographics and identify if there's still gaps in your communities, still gaps in your area. But as we just mentioned, also going back and getting continual feedback from your community partners is going to be critical at the beginning, throughout the duration, and then once you've completed and implemented a certain policy or strategy, are you moving the needle? Does the community feel an impact? It's also important to take into consideration additional barriers, such as, if we do provide additional public transportation stops or we implement a bike share program, are there potential barriers to that? Because we do see, for example, bike sharing is less used still in vulnerable communities because the financial impacts of that bike share program hit the vulnerable communities more. So if we're implementing this, are we also including some kind of grant program or assistance program for certain levels of income to be able to really adequately access that? So it's available, but is there true access to that? So quantifiable and getting that community feedback to understand if they feel that the needle is moving.
Great, thank you. And then I'm going to turn it back over to you, Dr. Campbell. What are some recommended tools that you have from your industry for local governments that could help us then with creating some of those metrics and setting some of those goalposts for us?
One of them is a initiative that I mentioned earlier in my talk, that it's just started it's just wrapping up as a collaboration between the Natural Hazard Center and the National Academies, and that's the Societal Experts Action Network. That is an ongoing initiative, again, that was started in response to the pandemic to create evidence-based strategies for decision makers at the state and local levels. So I think that that's a real resource that's offered through the National Academies, and my role in that, particularly in the disaster space, is developing guidance related to the intersections of the pandemic and other kinds of hazards and disasters. So, for example, we just released a paper this week that's focused on how to better support the disaster workforce, recognizing that these 18 months that the pandemic has been ongoing has put a lot of strain on emergency managers, on public health workers, and other folks in the disaster workforce, other first responders. And so how do we better support those populations? It answers some of those questions that have been asked recently, and these are turned over really quickly. So they work with organizations like the National League of Cities, for example, to keep their ear on the ground about what kinds of issues related to the pandemic are really challenging for decision makers, and where people are really needing those evidence-based strategies. So that's one that I think is really valuable, even outside of the realm of disasters. Another is, again, the Natural Hazard Center using our website. We have a variety of different products and programs. So they can be tools for decision making. They can be tools for getting more information. One of the ones that I'm most proud of is our suite of risk communication guidance, for example, and that walks through a series of step-by-step guides on how to best engage and communicate about the risks that are faced in vulnerable communities and in those marginalized populations, how to develop mutually reciprocal and trusting partnerships. And so that's something that I'm really pleased with, something we've gotten a lot of great feedback about. And I think it's applicable in a variety of different circumstances. Although we developed it in partnership with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, that guidance is really useful in a variety of different capacities. And so I think our information products serve as great tools, and also in some cases are tailored to really help you figure out, think through some of the policy issues, some of the other information needs, that how do we translate what we already know into best practices. So I would definitely encourage people to walk through some of the suite of resources we have on the Natural Hazard Center website, and also through the National Academies Societal Experts Action Network.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. I know I'm certainly going to be checking out that website. You just listed off a couple of really great topic points that I think could have a session all entirely on its own. But I know I have a couple more questions for these ladies. So please, I hope in the audience, we are going to save just some time for your questions as well, and virtually online. Please go ahead and start entering some questions in the chat. But one of the questions that I do have for all three of you, and we can do a little bit more of a quicker round robin, what do you think is the biggest challenge or effort doing this work. So we know that the goalposts are very lofty and that there's just so much under the umbrella. What do you particularly within your work feel is one of the bigger challenges that you face on a daily basis? So we'll go in the round of Nancy, Andrea, and then Dr. Campbell.
So I don't know that there's one obstacle, but there's a couple. One is in our line of work, we do face a lot of decision makers, a lot of people in positions of power that do not recognize the urgency of work that's being done and work that needs to be done. And that is a big deal. And then the other thing would be the lack of education and the lack of awareness of need. So those are two things. I know you asked for one. I don't think that we could get it down to one single thing, but I'll say those two.
So I'll add on to that I think prioritization is going to be a struggle. There are so many needs and there's so many concepts and categories that fall into environmental justice and equity. And how do we determine what we're going to address first? And how do we make that clear, our goals clear, and as well as our constraints clear, so that we maintain a level of trust with the communities that are serving, so that there's no thought that we're dropping the ball or we're ignoring anything, but we do have limitations. And so how do we prioritize that and effectively set our policies to meet these goals and start making an impact across the board?
And I think on my side, the answer would be having implementable strategies. I think that you've both raised really great points and things that I would have pointed to as well. But I think that that's another piece of this is translating, we understand that people have, often don't understand the issues, that they don't empathize with how consequential some of these decisions are for the people whose lives are affected by these decisions. But I also think that often decision makers struggle with how do we actually put this into practice? What does it mean to operationalize equity? And I think that we can do more, especially those of us who are involved in knowledge production, to not just disseminate our findings and say, okay, so you should understand now inequality is a problem, go do something about it, but really develop products that highlight successful models, strategies that are actually relevant to the ways that organizations operate, so that they can see how this concept that's often vague or seems so big that it's hard to tackle can be translated into their day-to-day activities and policies that they're developing, what it should look like in the actual practice of their ongoing operations.
Great, thank you. And then I know from my personal perspective, what I can add to that as well is just taking such a field that is very scientifically driven, data driven, and condensing this down into sound bites that both your council, your mayor and council, your city management, other departments, your community members all can digest. You have to be able to present the information in all of these different varying formats. And so I know that's definitely a big challenge that we're facing within our city on a daily basis. So again, we've been looking at this topic from the lens of equity. So it's just a very singular point of view within the topic of environmental sustainability. So I'm going to just quickly throw out another question to our panel here and change the lens of this conversation just briefly. What do you think is a pressing issue right now when we're looking at our environment? There's obviously many different topics that are important in this umbrella, but just from your personal perspective, what is one of those highlight issues that we have a room full of local government officials in the room, and what is something that they should be looking at in terms of our environmental sustainability? So that's a broad question, and you can go anywhere, and I give you the free rein. So Nancy.
Well, what I would say is no one person has a solution. And that often is a way of thinking. especially with government, that it's not my job, it's someone else's job. And we're all part of this complex society machine that we're in. And we've all got a part to play with that. We all have valuable experiences and background that can influence something for the good. And so seeing a need and not acting on it because it's not your job or it's not in your department or that's not what you were educated on, we've got to stop thinking like that and start talking to each other more and be willing to step up when we do see that. And that's something that can really help break down silos, which is definitely an issue within government organizations and with a lot of organizations. That's just the nature of bureaucracy. But I do think that that is something that it gets things sidetracked, it gets things derailed. Things cannot be what they could have been if people would step up and realize that, yeah, it is part of my job. And this is part of my society. So I'm going to step up and offer my point of view and my expertise and help if I can get this moving down the road a little bit faster.
Thank you. Andrea.
So taking it in a little bit of a different direction and given my background and my career in doing water studies, really climate resiliency, specifically managing our resources and the criticality of our water supply and infrastructure is it's been my focus and what I see as a really significant issue when it comes to the environment. As we've noted during COVID, access to water and access to clean water is made a huge difference in communities and how they responded and are impacted to the virus and health conditions. And it's going to be more and more of a concern, especially those here in the arid Southwest or part of the Colorado River basins, as we've noted in the news. It's going to continue to impact the individuals that are living here now, and then the economic growth of our communities and who's able to move where and what industry and businesses are going to be able to come into our communities and further bolster their growth. So being able to manage and incorporate our communities as stakeholders in that management of our resources is critical.
Thank you.
And I think, also really getting fairly specific into my line of work and my perspective would be investments and mitigation, looking towards the future. This is an adjustment that even I'm trying to make as a person who really started very narrowly focusing on disasters and particular types of disasters, and really starting to recognize what we're looking at down the line with climate change, and the fact that there needs to be investments now to bolster our infrastructure, both social and physical and natural, and to be prepared for the future that's coming. We have to address issues like inequality, the rising economic inequality in this country, to better support people so that we don't have a deepening crisis that continues to get worse because we didn't make the investment when we had the opportunity. Just as disasters are getting more and more expensive, more difficult to recover from because the price tag keeps increasing, that's going to continue. And that's also the case with the social consequences of disasters. So I think better supporting populations to get back on their feet, especially in the aftermath of the pandemic, although we're still in the middle of it, but having, being far enough into it to see what the consequences have been for vulnerable people, the fact that it's exacerbated those vulnerabilities. I think that's really important. And also investing in our future, rethinking what we're spending our funds on, and making those investments in our infrastructure, involving communities and collaborative planning around hazard mitigation, so that as the risks that they're facing, knowing that especially that vulnerable people, that marginalized communities, especially communities of color, are more likely to be affected by these challenges that we see because of our changing environment, involving them in the process and allocating funds so that we prioritize these things the way that they need to be prioritized, so that they don't become worse down the line because we failed to act now.
Thank you. And that goes back then again to that community engagement piece and hearing what the community wants as those priorities as well. So I know I've had a lot of opportunity to ask questions, and I just want to open the floor up to see if anyone in the audience or virtually online in the chat has any questions for us. We have one coming up.
Thank you, everyone, for your work. My name is Marcus Steele, and I'm a colleague of Andrea's over at the City of Mesa, Arizona. So the Department I work in is the Arts and Culture Department. We have about 9 or 10 buildings, hundreds of thousands of square feet, and we just did an energy audit on our light bulbs alone. We do have 4 pretty dynamic theaters and some museums, and so their lighting needs are a little bit different. So we are one of our other departments did our energy audit. And then the price tag comes back between $250 and about $450,000 to replace all the light bulbs and some of the fixtures. So the question to this group is, although we're doing dynamic work and it is important for that investment in the future, how do we pay for it now? And because when the price tag comes out and our director receives it, city manager's office receives that price tag, everybody's hands kind of come up and say, well, I don't know, we'll have to figure out how to fund it. So where does this get funded from? I know there's on the policy making side, those are from private organizations or foundations, which is great. And then how do municipal leaders actually find the money for this? Thanks.
Thank you. And I think that's a good question into budget and funding. And I'll open it up to any of our panelists who want to try and tackle that big lofty question.
Well, I'll jump in here.
Thank
So
you.
I know with the city of Phoenix that we do, it's almost like a continual budget process. We are always looking at our budget. We're always looking at what our needs are. We have a general plan. And so we've got a lot of things that we know should be happening at a certain time. So we try to plan for those. But then again, we also have community groups coming up saying we want this as well. We need this as well. We have department heads and expertise there and external partners in different organizations. Some are nonprofit NGOs, others are state governments, other local governments, federal governments that have changes to programs that we thought we were going to fund this way that are always happening. And so to fund things like what you just described, I know that with the city of Phoenix, there's no one way to do that. It is a continual budgeting process and always, always, always looking for those other sources of funding and trying to show that benefit of investing those dollars in this project will result in a savings of this amount over this time. And presenting that to your policymakers and your decision makers. And sometimes, you know, it's a great decision to invest that, but you don't show a payback that folks want to see, but you may see a quality of life. And measuring those qualitative impacts as a result of expending money is harder than the quantitative. And I don't have an answer for that. I just know that for us at the city of Phoenix, this is the way that it's a continual process. It's always planning, always looking, always assessing, always monitoring, and trying to come up with the payback on those, the quantitative impacts of making that change. But that would be the advice that I would give to you. But I don't know if anyone could come up with a great way of measuring qualitative impacts. You could like go on a world tour.
Thank you for giving that one a shot, Nancy. And I think that also goes back to being able to communicate effectively in terms of the different projects on how all of this is a layered approach and package. So being able to take it to your leadership, and while it may be lighting within an art studio or different types of facilities, being able to explain and make those case studies then by decreasing less energy and how, you know, those types of funding that were going into your energy could then be put back into programs that you were going to build within your particular facility, and how those programs can then maybe benefit those who wouldn't have otherwise access to that. And the different types of co-benefits, I think, is a big important topic when we're looking at environmental sustainability. Decreased energy use has an effect then on things like our water supply and the energy then that's going into treating our water facilities, or being able then to say less energy means that we're also decreasing then the heat impact and the different types of mitigation efforts. So being able then to take those singular projects and prioritizing them within your own departments or your own cities, and then being able to effectively speak to either your leadership or the community members and framing those conversations into how it is most effectively going to make an impact into them. So want to open it up one last time to any other audience questions, or do we have any in the chat? No? Okay. Then to wrap up our session, we have about 5 minutes left. I want to ask these ladies, what is your best advice for moving the needle of equity within this field? And just a great way to round up the topic positively, giving a call to action for everyone in this room. What is the one thing that they can all go back to within their local governments and do to help move the needle in this work? So with that, Nancy?
Well, I would say, like I've been saying before, talk to people. Let them know. A lot of people don't know, or they've only heard equity every now and then. They don't know what it is. Talk to them about how they can integrate that into what they do every day. Let them know. When you start the conversation and you keep it going, you'll get someplace.
I concur. Communication is going to be key. If you have someone within your local government that serves as a liaison to various communities, even better. If not, if you have some transparency, some communication, some information on your website, if you are supporting school initiatives, Phoenix has sustainability officers at their high schools to share information with our youth. But communication, getting information out there, and hopefully having that be a two-way dialogue and being receptive and doing something with feedback that you're receiving from the community. That's what's really going to be able to move the needle and have true collaboration and partnership with our communities.
And I would just concur with everything that Nancy and Andrea said. From my perspective, definitely, especially working with youth and working with people who can be professionalized into these roles, mentoring people, bringing them in through, for example, the program that you mentioned with high school students, putting sustainability on the radar of folks who already have connections to communities and helping them professionalize into the fields where they can make a difference and bring the lens of those communities to bear in practice is really important. So I think that involves both communication, that level of outreach that you were both speaking about, and really investing in making sure that they can enter these spaces where they have power over decision making, where they can make those voices heard, is just vitally important.
Thank you, ladies. I think that's a wonderful place to wrap up. And my big call to action and challenge to all of you is no matter which department, which field your expertise lies in, our environment is all around us. Equity can be applied to any of your different departments. It's the human impact of what we are doing as local government servants. And so being able to take all of these topics that these ladies have kind of brought to the forefront and looking at how they can apply within your different areas. And so I want to thank all three panelists today for their insight. And if we can get their contact information one more time on the screen, please reach out to them if you have any additional questions or would like to contact them for any of their additional insight. But if we can please give them a round of applause and thank them for their time this morning.